Hello students, this video is being recorded in the summer of 2020, still in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. You no doubt realize by now that great speakers and speeches will remain fully online during the fall semester, so I am preparing a video version of each lecture for the class and making all the lessons available on YouTube. Enjoy the lecture. So we continue with our women's suffrage theme, looking at Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Solitude of Self. But now we have advanced 20 years beyond the time when Susan B. Anthony attempted to vote in the national election. And we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton's address. She gave this speech 3 times, once each to a House committee and a Senate committee in the U.S. Congress, and then once to the National Convention of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and the speech was delivered in 1892. First, a little bit about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was born in Johnstown, New York on November 12, 1815. Her father had been a one-term congressman and later was also a federal judge. And yet he also was a slave owner. He owned one slave. Slavery was still legal in New York until the 1820s. In 1832, Elizabeth Cady was the only female graduate of Johnstown Academy, and she later attended Troy Female Seminary. In 1840, she married abolitionist Henry Brewster Stanton and became herself an active abolitionist. And that same year, actually on her honeymoon, she attended the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. And there she met Lucretia Mott, and the two of them, along with other women, experienced being excluded from the convention, not allowed to speak or participate as delegates because they were female. And this began a long collaboration with Lucretia Mott. In 1843, she and her husband moved to Chelsea, Massachusetts, and while living in the Boston area, she became involved in the intellectual circle that included, among other people, someone we've already studied, that is Ralph Waldo Emerson. And in that intellectual group, she also met Margaret Fuller, who was a significant influence on Elizabeth Cady Stanton's philosophy. In 1847, she moved to Seneca Falls, New York, and in 1848, along with Lucretia Mott, organized the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. Together, they drafted the Declaration of Sentiments, and many historians consider that Seneca Falls Convention to be the origin or the originating event of the women's rights movement in America. In 1851, she first met Susan B. Anthony and began a lifelong collaboration with Anthony on women's rights. Indeed, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote many of the speeches for Susan B. Anthony. In 1851, she was also the founder of the New York Women's Temperance Society. And we talked about this briefly in connection with Susan B. Anthony, but the women's rights movement, especially the women's suffrage movement, and the temperance societies were closely allied. And they were because, from the point of view of many women in the 19th century, women's suffrage was the instrument by which temperance would be accomplished. That is, only if women had the vote could they remove the influence of alcohol in society. Alcohol consumption by men was considered to be detrimental to family life and dangerous to women. And so many of the women who were in support of women's rights were also supporters of the temperance movement. In 1854, Elizabeth Cady Stanton gave her famous address to the legislature of New York in Albany. And if you were lucky enough to be in my propaganda and persuasion class, perhaps you recall reading that address to the New York legislature. In 1866, although again women could not vote, Elizabeth Cady Stanton ran for Congress in New York and actually received 24 votes, although I'm sure most of the men did not take her candidacy seriously. In 1868, at a National Women's Suffrage Convention, she gave another of her well-known speeches entitled The Destructive Male, which was another speech in favor of the woman's suffrage amendment. And in that same year, she joined Susan B. Anthony in commencing the publication of their women's rights newspaper, The Revolution. The following year, she joined Susan B. Anthony in forming the National Women's Suffrage Association. This was part of the split in the national suffrage movement, and she took the side with Susan B. Anthony in opposition to the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment, again, was the amendment which gave former slaves the right to vote, and both Anthony and Stanton believed that the amendment should explicitly include women also. Some women's rights advocates believe the 15th Amendment should be allowed to proceed, giving former slaves the right to vote, and that women should focus on a separate amendment for women's suffrage. But Anthony and Stanton opposed the 15th Amendment, and it caused a major division in the women's suffrage movement in America. Throughout the 1870s, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a lecturer on the Lyceum circuit. She would go around to different towns and offer lectures on a variety of subjects and topics, mostly related to women's rights. And in 1876, she began a collaboration with Susan B. Anthony and Matilda Jocelyn Gage in writing a history of women's suffrage, the first volume of which was published in 1881. In 1880, just as Susan B. Anthony had done in the 1872 national election, Elizabeth Cady Stanton attempted to vote in the 1880 election. And in 1890, she was elected president of the now newly reunited National American Women's Suffrage Association. And 2 years later, at the convention of that group, and then also at both the House and Senate committees considering suffrage amendment, she gave her famous Solitude of Self address. In 1895, she published the Women's Bible, in which she did an analysis of Scripture to point out what she thought were the ways that the Bible encouraged the oppression of women. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton died on October 26, 1902, in New York City. So we turn now to her famous Solitude of Self address, and we ask our basic questions. What is the genre of the speech? And then, in consideration of the rhetorical situation, what is the exigence, the audience, and the constraints? And the genre question really is a complex one because this is an unusual speech. It is in some ways clearly deliberative insofar as she is addressing committees of the House and of the Senate and has in mind support of a suffrage amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But it is also a philosophical dissertation, a sort of existential reflection on the human condition. So what is the exigence here? The immediate political exigence, obviously, is to gain passage of the women's suffrage amendment and to encourage women in the full participation of their citizenship rights. But I think we can also understand that Elizabeth Cady Stanton sees the opportunity to offer a different approach to that question, and to do that in a way that both the men and the women in her audience could relate to and identify with. So who then is her audience? We know that in the House and the Senate, her immediate audience, that is, especially those who would have the power to pass the amendment, would be the congressmen and senators she was addressing. They would be the ones who would have the power to pass or at least recommend the passage of a women's suffrage amendment to the Constitution. But also we know the speech was given at the National American Women's Suffrage Association convention. So I think we can understand that this speech is also directed toward really any human being who might have experienced the same solitude of self that Elizabeth Cady Stanton is talking about. What she's getting at here certainly is a common human condition. That is something that every human being, regardless of politics, regardless of the period of time in which you live, regardless of the place where you exist, that every human being shares this essential condition of being a solitary individual. And so then what are the constraints? In one sense, the constraints are that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the other women's suffrage advocates have been unable to get a suffrage amendment passed, though they have been trying now for something close to 25 years, and still none of the arguments that they've used, and we've become familiar with many of those from the previous speeches that we've read, that none of those arguments have seemed to work. And so I think what Elizabeth Cady Stanton is recognizing is the need for a new strategy here. And her approach, I think, is partly a response to that realization. And so she is constrained in some ways by the history of the women's suffrage movement and the recognition that those previous attempts have failed. She's looking for and is constrained by the need to find some common ground, some transcendent sense of the common human condition that would reach across gender boundaries, reach across political lines, be true about every individual human being, whether that person is an advocate for suffrage or whether that person is a male committee member in the United States Congress. So let's turn to some of the critical questions for this address. Who were the three audiences for the speech? And what is the implied audience from the text? And so we've talked about the three audiences, but maybe the interesting critical question here is the implied audience from the text. That is, as you read the text, who is it? That is, what kind of person is it that would respond to the narratives and the appeals and the discussion that takes place in the address? Who do you imagine, in other words, Elizabeth Cady Stanton has in mind when she's crafting the address? Is it just that she's writing for the immediate political purposes, for the immediate political audience of the members of Congress? Or does she have in mind perhaps any human being who has thought about their own existence or who has reflected on their own solitude, their own individual existence in the world? Is there a sense then in which the speech addresses not merely those who might have a political stake in the passage of a suffrage amendment, but maybe goes way beyond that to speak to the common human condition? So what are the parts of the speech that seem to summon a much wider human audience, those who would have the same kind of questions or philosophical reflections about their own existence? And then, in what ways does the speech conform to traditional deliberative expectations? And then, how does the speech deviate from traditional and conventional modes of deliberative persuasion? We've said that there are clearly deliberative elements of the speech, and we might be able to recognize certain aspects of it that seem to conform to the traditional deliberative expectations of that genre. But it's also clear that there are elements of this speech which deviate from the traditional expectations. So how can we account for those ways in which the speech is in some ways quite remarkably different than what one would expect from a speech to a House or a Senate committee? Contrast this speech, for instance, to the speech given by Victoria Woodhull, also at a House Judiciary Committee, and we can begin to recognize some of the ways in which the Stanton address is different. And then how does the sex of the speaker influence her approach to persuasion? Do you think that this is a characteristic instance of female oratory? That is, are the emotional elements and the narrative elements of the speech something that we would typically associate with women speakers? Or is this something rather that Elizabeth Cady Stanton has chosen as a particular strategy in her rhetorical situation. Regardless of the sex of the speaker, was this a good choice for her approach to the questions before the committee and before the convention? Some additional critical questions. What are the major emotional elements of the speech, and how are the emotions aroused? What specific rhetorical technique or strategy does Stanton employ? So as you look at the speech, it's clear there are portions where pathos is the primary mode of appeal. And so we can look at the ways in which Stanton uses certain techniques of rhetoric, whether that's narrative storytelling or whether that's graphic description. And we can say, what are the strategies that she's employing to make that portion of the speech highly emotional? And also, what are the major metaphorical images used, and how do they help Stanton achieve her rhetorical goals? So as you're going through the speech, and we'll focus on a couple of these in our textual analysis in a few minutes, but what are the major metaphors here? What's the imagery, the figurative imagery that she uses to make the point that she wants to make to the House Committee and the Senate Committee especially? And how does Stanton use narrative, that is essentially storytelling, in the speech? You'll find as you're reading the speech that there are several portions where she kind of digresses from the main argument and focuses on telling a story or giving an account of certain things that have occurred. And so what's the purpose of inserting those narratives within the text of the speech? And then finally, what does the speech gain from its very personal tone and approach? We've talked about this speech as a kind of existential reflection, and that almost inevitably means it's going to be highly personal. And so how does that very personal, almost intimate level of self-disclosure help Stanton advance her cause? So before we look at the text of the speech, let's take a look at the article by Carlin Corse Campbell entitled Stanton's The Solitude of Self, a Rationale for Feminism. And this is a well-known study of the Stanton speech. And Campbell points out early in the article that the speech, The Solitude of Self, is unlike the usual rhetoric of social activists of any period. And it is a startling departure from the typical speeches and arguments of 19th century feminists. And we should be able to recognize that right away because we've seen two other well-known examples, the Victoria Woodhull speech and the Susan B. Anthony trial speech, which would be more typical of the arguments of 19th century feminists. So Campbell goes on to observe, the address is extraordinary because it is a philosophical statement of the principles and values underlying the struggle for women's rights in the United States. It is also extraordinary because it is a social reformer's defense of humanistic individualism, and because it is a rhetorical statement of the limits of those things which can be altered by words. So here, what does Campbell mean when she says it's a rhetorical statement of the limits of those things which can be altered by words? In one sense, it might be a recognition that the conventional arguments and appeals made by women's suffrage advocates up till the time of 1892 have not worked. But I think more importantly is this idea that no matter how eloquent someone is, or no matter how good or strong the arguments are, rhetoric as an art is incapable of altering certain fundamental aspects of the human condition. That is, you can be eloquent, you can make a really strong argument, but it doesn't change the fact that every human being still must go through their life as a solitary individual. And so rhetoric, in other words, does not reach that philosophical truth or that philosophical condition of solitude. Campbell continues by identifying her two purposes in the address. I have two purposes, she says. First, to use the speech as a means to discover and detail the ideology of 19th century feminism, and second, to examine its unusual features, particularly its lyric tone and its tragic perspective, to discover how and why it still has the power to speak to and move today's audience. So a couple of things about this observation by Carlin Corse Campbell. One, she talks about the philosophy or ideology of 19th century feminism. And here I would point to the influence of Margaret Fuller on Elizabeth Cady Stanton. We talked about Fuller being in that circle of intellectuals with Ralph Waldo Emerson, whom Stanton encountered when living in Boston. But we also see here the basic preview of Campbell's argument. That is, her interpretation of the speech will be one which focuses on what she calls the lyric tone of Stanton's address and also its tragic perspective. And then finally, note Campbell's assumption here that the speech continues to speak to and move today's audience. So that, I think, brings us back to the rhetorical situation, and in particular to the question of the audience for Stanton's address. Like several of the other speeches that we've looked at, I think it's clear in this instance that Stanton has in mind a much wider audience, certainly an audience, a historical audience that would go beyond her own day and time, because what she's reflecting on is something common to the human condition. Campbell next observes that Stanton was a skilled rhetor who had spoken and testified frequently before legislative groups since her address to the New York State Legislature in 1854. Her earlier speeches demonstrated an ability to marshal evidence and to make cogent arguments and moving appeals. In 1892, she was 76 years old, and the wary contemporary critic might wonder whether the qualities of the speech reflect her rhetorical skills or her recognition of approaching death. But Campbell's position is that what we see in Solitude of Self is Stanton's deliberately chosen strategy. It is not merely an older person offering that kind of existential reflection on her life toward the end of her life. But I think Campbell's point here is that if Stanton wanted to, she could have very easily gone back to the expected arguments and appeals that we associate with the advocacy of women's suffrage. She had done that other times before and did it well. And so the fact that she did not do it here ought to be seen as a shift in strategy adopted by Stanton because of a recognition, perhaps, of the failure of those previous attempts. But what is that shift in strategy? Campbell points out that rhetorically, the address violates nearly all traditional canons. That is, it doesn't do what a typical deliberative speech ought to do. It has no logical structure, says Campbell. It has no proper introduction, for example, right? And she says the speech is unusual first because it is a rhetorical act in the lyric mode. And then she explains what lyricism is. Typically, the lyric poem, and we associate lyricism or the lyric form mostly with poetry, but she says typically the lyric poem attempts to explore and express all facets of a feeling or attitude in a series of statements related by the fact that they are all about a single subject. The parts are related to each other as the spokes of a wheel are related to the axle. And of course here, the single subject is the title of the address, The Solitude of Self. So if Campbell is correct, then we can look for all of the different ways that Elizabeth Cady Stanton expresses those feelings and attitudes and ideas about that single subject of the solitude of self. But then she also goes on to say the form of the speech and its mode of expression are lyric, but its perspective is tragic, a philosophical stance common in literature, but rare in rhetoric. So what does she mean by the tragic perspective? We move here to the passage on the right. The tragic perspective in Stanton's speech is evident. Like tragedy, the speech focuses on the life of the individual. It emphasizes beginnings and endings. In fact, it reminds one vividly that suffering and death are the inevitable lot of humans. It isolates the individual from the community, focuses on fate as an element in human affairs, and emphasizes the crisis in human experience. The tragic perspective limits rhetorical acts severely. Rhetoric usually is comic because, given its commitment to the efficacy of deliberation and social action, it must opt to emphasize rationality, the community, cyclical survival, and progress. But then Campbell explains how the two aspects of the speech, the tragic perspective and the lyric mode, how they work together. The interrelationship between form and substance in rhetoric is illustrated in this speech by the ways in which the qualities of lyric form, particularly its emphasis on the subjective and sensual, come to modify Stanton's tragic perspective. So, in other words, even though the tragic perspective is, well, tragic, the lyric mode mitigates that a bit. That is, it makes it more palatable for a rhetorical address to an audience in an immediate rhetorical situation. So this strategic combination of the lyric mode with the tragic perspective creates this kind of philosophical discourse, and it's a discourse that allows Stanton to speak for all humanity. As Campbell points out, now at the end of her speaking career, Stanton demonstrates her moral preeminence as one who can see and feel the conditions of others through herself. As a result, she speaks for all women of all ages, in all roles, and in all conditions of life. Indeed, she speaks for all persons, rich and poor, male and female, educated and uneducated. What she expresses and evokes is the nature of the human condition, and what her audience experiences is the lonely and troubled solitude of the individual, for which each person requires all of the opportunities that can be provided by society. And there then we get maybe the key idea in Stanton's speech. If we are all alike, alone, that is solitary, individual, in our attempt to survive in the world, then why does society disadvantage women by not affording them all of the same faculties and training and education and opportunities that are given to men, since all human beings, men and women, face the same struggle of solitary existence? So let's take a look then at the text of the Solitude of Self. So at the beginning of the speech, Stanton makes clear that this is not going to be your usual deliberative argument, especially one that would be expected before a legislative committee. And so she focuses first on the idea of individuality. The point I wish plainly to bring before you on this occasion is the individuality of each human soul, our Protestant idea, the right of individual conscience and judgment, our Republican idea, individual citizenship. In discussing the rights of woman, we are to consider first what belongs to her as an individual in a world of her own, the arbiter of her own destiny, an imaginary Robinson Crusoe with her woman Friday on a solitary island. Her rights under such circumstances are to use all her faculties for her own safety and happiness. So here it's interesting that she uses this literary image of Robinson Crusoe. If you know the story by Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe is shipwrecked on an island. He lives by himself, alone, relying only on his own faculties and his own skills and his own knowledge to survive, until eventually he finds one other companion whom he names Friday, an indigenous person living on the island. But Stanton's point here is that in our own existence, that is, in our own lives, all of us are like Robinson Crusoe. That is, we live our lives in a solitary, individual way. Though we be part of a community or part of a family or part of society, ultimately on the big questions we are left alone to determine answers for ourselves. And so each of us needs to have all of the faculties, all of the training, all of the knowledge and education that is available, and have that equally in order to face that same existence. She goes on to say, the isolation of every human soul and the necessity of self-dependence must give each individual the right to choose his own surroundings. The strongest reason for giving women all the opportunities for higher education, for the full development of her faculties, forces of mind and body, for giving her the most enlarged freedom of thought and action, a complete emancipation from all forms of bondage, of custom, dependence, superstition, from all the crippling influences of fear, is the solitude and personal responsibility of her own individual life. The strongest reason why we ask for women a voice in the government under which she lives, in the religion she is asked to believe, equality in social life where she is the chief factor, a place in the trades and professions where she may earn her bread, is because of her birthright to self-sovereignty, because as an individual she must rely on herself. So again, continuing that theme of the individual struggle, which is common to all human beings, and the necessity for women to have all the same advantages, or at least not to be disadvantaged in that common struggle. So then here Stanton introduces one of the first major metaphors of her address. No matter how much women prefer to lean, that is, lean on men, to be protected and supported, nor how much men desire to have them do so, they must make the voyage of life alone. And for safety in an emergency, they must know something of the laws of navigation. To guide our own craft, we must be captain, pilot, engineer, with chart and compass to stand at the wheel, to match the wind and waves, and know when to take in the sail, and to read the signs in the firmament over all. It matters not whether the solitary voyager is man or woman. So a couple of things about this metaphor. First, there's another portion of the speech where she talks about being on a ship on the ocean in the middle of the night, out in the middle of the ocean, crossing the Atlantic, and being sort of aware of her existence as a tiny speck in the universe, and coming to a consciousness of that deep solitude of self or isolation of the individual. And that story or account of her own travel, of course, relates directly to the use of this metaphor here. But she's also choosing a metaphor which is not only familiar to everybody in the audience and would have been familiar to virtually anybody reading the speech at that time, but she's talking about what has traditionally been mainly a male occupation. If we think about the captain of a ship or the pilot of a ship or the engineer of a steamship, for instance, these would have been male occupations mostly in 1892. And yet what Stanton is using that metaphor to express is that women too need all of the skills of navigation, because like men, they too must face that struggle of existence in the world individually and on a solitary basis. So then Stanton turns to another major metaphoric or figurative image in the speech, when she says, to appreciate the importance of fitting every human soul for independent action, think for a moment of the immeasurable solitude of self. And of course, from this passage, we get the title of the address. She continues, we come into the world alone, unlike all who have gone before us. We leave it alone under circumstances peculiar to ourselves. No mortal ever has been, no mortal ever will be like the soul just launched on the sea of life. There can never again be just such environments as make up the infancy, youth, and manhood of this one. Seeing, then, what must be the infinite diversity in human character, we can, in a measure, appreciate the loss to a nation when any large class of the people is uneducated and unrepresented in the government. We ask for the complete development of every individual first for his own benefit and happiness. In fitting out an army, we give each soldier his own knapsack, arms, powder, his blanket, cup, knife, fork, and spoon. We provide alike for all their individual necessities, and then each man bears his own burden. So the metaphoric image here, of course, is that of the individual soldier. But like the previous metaphor of the navigator or the ship's captain, we are talking about an occupation which in 1892 was principally held by men. And so I think Stanton is choosing metaphors which relate more closely to the masculine audience of the House and Senate committees that she is addressing. And then we talked in our discussion of the critical questions about the centrality of narrative in the address. And here's an example of what I'm talking about in a passage that is both narrative in structure and highly emotional. The great lesson that nature seems to teach us at all ages is self-dependence, self-protection, self-support. What a touching instance of a child's solitude, of that hunger of heart for love and recognition, in the case of the little girl who helped to dress a Christmas tree for the children of the family in which she served. On finding there was no present for herself, she slipped away in the darkness and spent the night in an open field, sitting on a stone, and when found in the morning was weeping as if her heart would break. No mortal will ever know the thoughts that passed through the mind of that friendless child in the long hours of that cold night, with only the silent stars to keep her company. The mention of her case in the daily papers moved many generous hearts to send her presents, but in the hours of her keenest sufferings, she was thrown wholly on herself for consolation. So again here, in some instances, like the rhetoric of the abolitionist movement, of which she also was a part, we see the use of description and narrative and the desire to encourage a sympathy, that is, an emotional identification with the person described in the story. Stanton reflects further on this, and especially on how the condition of solitude might be borne by young women, in this case a teenager, who finds herself alone in the world. The girl of 16, thrown on the world to support herself, to make her own place in society, to resist the temptations that surround her and maintain a spotless integrity, must do all this by native force or superior education. She does not acquire this power by being trained to trust others and distrust herself. If she wearies of the struggle, finding it hard to swim upstream and allow herself to drift with the current, she will find plenty of company, but not one to share her misery in the hour of her deepest humiliation. If she tried to retrieve her position, to conceal the past, her life is hedged about with fears, lest willing hands should tear the veil from what she fain would hide. Young and friendless, she knows the bitter solitude of self. How the little courtesies of life on the surface of society, deemed so important from man towards woman, fade into utter insignificance in view of the deeper tragedies in which she must play her part alone, where no human aid is possible. So just to be clear here, what Stanton is talking about when she talks about the misery in the hour of her deepest humiliation is an instance where, for instance, a teenage girl might find herself pregnant but without a husband. And so that would be her deepest humiliation, and she would find herself then without aid, without the aid of a family or society, and have to handle all of that circumstance on her own. She knows the bitter solitude of self. And then she continues with this theme, talking about women in childbirth who go, as she says, to the gates of death to give life to every man, and how that is the supreme moment of the solitude of self. And then she turns to a religious appeal, even though she herself did not participate in conventional organized religion. But she talks about how even Jesus experienced the solitude of self. Whatever the theories may be of woman's dependence on man, in the supreme moments of her life, he cannot bear her burdens. Alone she goes to the gates of death to give life to every man that is born into the world. No one can share her fears, no one mitigate her pangs, and if her sorrow is greater than she can bear, alone she passes beyond the gates into the vast unknown. From the mountain tops of Judea long ago, a heavenly voice bade his disciples, "Bear ye one another's burdens." But humanity has not yet risen to that point of self-sacrifice, and if ever so willing, how few the burdens are that one soul can bear for another. In the highways of Palestine, in prayer and fasting on the solitary mountaintop, in the Garden of Gethsemane, before the judgment seat of Pilate, betrayed by one of his trusted disciples at his Last Supper, in his agonies on the cross, even Jesus of Nazareth, in these last sad days on earth, felt the awful solitude of self. Deserted by man, in agony he cries, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And so it ever must be in the conflicting scenes of life, on the long, weary march, each one walks alone. So again, we can see the activity of the lyric mode in the speech, how with each passage that we review, we see another way that Stanton expresses the attitudes and feelings associated with the main theme of the solitude of self. And here we come to this passage that I referenced earlier, the one where she talks about crossing the Atlantic. "I remember once, in crossing the Atlantic, to have gone upon the deck of the ship at midnight, when a dense black cloud enveloped the sky, and the great deep was roaring madly under the lashes of demoniac winds. My feeling was not of danger or fear, which is a base surrender of the immortal soul, but of utter desolation and loneliness, a little speck of life shut in by a tremendous darkness. Again, I remember to have climbed the slopes of the Swiss Alps, up beyond the point where vegetation ceases, and the stunted conifers no longer struggle against the unfeeling blasts. Around me lay a huge confusion of rocks, out of which the gigantic ice peaks shot into the measureless blue of the heavens, and again my only feeling was the awful solitude. And yet there is a solitude which each and every one of us has always carried with him, more inaccessible than the ice-cold mountains, more profound than the midnight sea, the solitude of self, our inner being which we call ourself, no eye nor touch of man or angel has ever pierced. Such is individual life. Who, I ask you, can dare take on himself the rights, the duties, the responsibilities of another human soul? And so there she concludes the address, and she does so again, reasserting the main theme, that in order to confront the individual struggles of life, every person, man and woman, must have all the opportunities, education, and advantages of every other person, that they must have equal ability to face the solitude of self. So we'll end here by noting that it's not until 1920 that women gained the right to vote. That's a full 28 years after Elizabeth Cady Stanton delivered this address, and indeed a full 18 years after she died. In fact, neither Susan B. Anthony nor Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived to see women get the right to vote or the passage of a national suffrage amendment. And in fact, as the date on the front page of this Lowell Sun newspaper shows, it was August in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was finally fully ratified and women gained the right to vote. So 100 years from the time that this lecture was being recorded, 100 years ago, women gained the right to vote. But now, having seen the efforts of people like Victoria Woodhull, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the other female suffrage advocates, how hard and how long they had to work to gain the right to vote, I would encourage everyone to vote in the upcoming election, and especially all the women in the class to live up to the legacy left to them by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to not take for granted the right that they won with great sacrifice and lifelong struggle. So if you have any questions or comments on the Elizabeth Cady Stanton Solitude of Self address, please post those questions or comments to the discussion board.